Bienvenidos a un nuevo video. El día de hoy vamos a hablar sobre 18 cosas que no sabrías sobre B.F. Skinner. Comencemos. Número 1. El legado de Skinner. Burrhus Frederic Skinner nació en 1904 en Susquehanna, Pensilvania. Fue un reputado psicólogo y conductista estadounidense. Estudió literatura inglesa y filosofía en el Hamilton College de Clinton, Nueva York, en 1922 y se doctoró en psicología por la Universidad de Harvard en 1931. Skinner es conocido sobre todo por su trabajo pionero en el campo del conductismo, centrado en el estudio de cómo el comportamiento se ve determinado por sus consecuencias. Su trabajo ha tenido un impacto duradero en el campo de la psicología y ha influido ampliamente en el desarrollo del conductismo moderno. Número 2. El padre del conductismo. En 1926, Skinner comenzó sus estudios en la Universidad de Harvard, donde se doctor- doctoraría en 1931. Durante su estancia en Harvard, Skinner se interesó por la psicología y el conductismo, que se convertirían en el centro de su investigación, y enseña durante el resto de su carrera. Su tesis doctoral titulada El comportamiento de los organismos fue un trabajo pionero en el campo del conductismo y convirtió a Skinner en uno de los psicólogos más influyentes del siglo XX. Número 3. Skinner, una vida en la ciencia. Skinner fue un reputado investigador de la Universidad de Harvard hasta 1936, cuando aceptó un puesto de profesor en la Universidad de Minnesota. Al cabo de unos años se trasladó a la Universidad de Indiana, donde se siguió enseñando e investigando durante el resto de su carrera. Su trabajo en ambas universidades fue muy influyente en el campo de la psicología y su legado se sigue sintiendo hasta nuestros días. Número 4. El comportamiento de los organismos, una obra clásica de la psicología. En 1938, el famoso psicólogo Skinner publicó los resultados de sus revolucionarios experimentos del condicionamiento operante en el libro El comportamiento de los organismos. Este libro fue un hito importante en el campo de la psicología, ya que detallaba los experimentos de Skinner y los resultados de su investigación sobre los efectos del esfuerzo positivo y negativo en el comportamiento. El libro fue muy elogiado por su enfoque detallado y exhaustivo del tema, y sigue siendo una referencia importante para los psicólogos en la actualidad. Número 5. La cuna Baby Tender, un diseño de cuna seguro y eficaz. En 1943, el prestigioso psicólogo Skinner diseñó el revolucionario Baby Tender, una cuna mucho más segura que las tradicionales. La cuna ofrecía un entorno con temperatura controlada, una tapa transparente para facilitar la vigilancia y un colchón en forma de hamaca para reducir el riesgo de asfixia. Este innovador diseño supuso un gran paso adelante en la seguridad de los entornos del sueño infantil y desde entonces ha sido adoptado por muchos padres y cuidadores. Número 6. El poder de las palomas. En 1944, Skinner formó parte de un proyecto pionero conocido como Proyecto Paloma, que pretendía entrenar a las palomas para dirigir bombas durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. El proyecto consistía en enseñar a las aves a picotear un objetivo, lo que des- desencadenaría el lanzamiento de las bombas en dicha fecha. El trabajo de Skinner en este proyecto fue revolucionario, ya que era la primera vez que se utilizaban animales para controlar armas en la guerra. Número 7. El padre del conductismo. En 1945, Skinner fue nombrado director del Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad de Indiana, cargo que ocupó durante los 5 años siguientes. Durante este tiempo, llevó a cabo investigaciones pioneras en el campo del conductismo, que tuvieron un profundo impacto en el campo de la psicología. También escribió varios libros influyentes, entre ellos Science and Human Behavior y Verbal Behavior, que siguen siendo muy leídos hoy en día. Su trabajo en la Universidad de Indiana contribuyó a consolidarse como uno de los psicólogos más influyentes del siglo XX. Número 8. El padre del conductismo. En 1948, el célebre psicólogo Skinner regresó a la Universidad de Harvard como profesor titular, donde escribiría la impresionante cifra de 21 libros y 180 artículos. Sus obras abarcaron una amplia gama de temas, desde el conductismo hasta la educación, y su influencia en el campo de la psicología aún se deja sentir hoy en día. Número 9. Más allá de la libertad y la dignidad. Vida y obra de Skinner. Skinner escribió varias obras en las que aplicaba sus teorías conductistas a la sociedad, entre ellas el influyente libro de 1971, Más allá de la libertad y la dignidad. Este libro fue recibido tanto con elogios como con críticas, y en 1974 Skinner trató de aclarar sus teorías con la publicación de Acerca del conductismo. En este libro, Skinner intentaba explicar sus teorías de forma más accesible y abordar las interpretaciones erróneas de su obra que había surgido a raíz de Más allá de la libertad y la dignidad. Número 10. El legado de Skinner sigue vivo. El 18 de agosto de 1990, Skinner falleció a los 86 años de edad a causa de una leucemia. Su legado perdura a través de la Fundación Skinner, dirigida por su hija Julie S. Vargas. La fundación sigue promoviendo las creencias de Skinner y trabaja para hacer avanzar la ciencia del comportamiento y su aplicación humanitaria a la solución de problemas humanos y animales. Número 11. Skinner miraba al ser humano como una máquina que funcionaba con un sistema predeterminado. Número 12. Con sus conocimientos y gustos por la mecánica en su infancia, fabricó cañones miniatura que funcionaban a vapor y estos lanzaban vegetales. Normalmente, su blanco era siempre las casas de los vecinos. Número 13. Entrenó palomas para jugar ping-pong y para dirigir proyectiles a un blanco específico. Número 14. Tuvo un sueño de ser novelista profesional. Luego de muchos estudios en filosofía, no le llegó la inspiración y terminó en un completo fracaso. Número 15. Se convenció de que las mujeres no lo querían a tal grado de tatuarse las iniciales de una de ellas para recordar la decepción que le causaba. Número 16. Las técnicas de Skinner servían tanto para hacerse cargo de ratas de laboratorio, de vendedores y obreros, así como para entrenar mascotas o hijos. Número 7. Número 17. Era capaz de condicionar una paloma en menos de 3 minutos. Y por último, número 18. Entrenó palomas en la Segunda Guerra Mundial con el fin de guiarlas con misiles a cosas específicas. Pues bueno, espero que les haya gustado estos 18 datos que no sabía sobre Skinner. A continuación les voy a dejar un video de unas charlas de este personaje histórico e influyente dentro del campo de la psicología. Pues bueno, yo soy su amigo Ángel02MX y espero que les haya gustado este video, y si les gustó, ya saben, déjenme su bonito like y suscríbanse para yo seguir subiendo este tipo de contenido. Nos vemos en un próximo video. Hasta pronto.
Otra figura esencial en el estudio del aprendizaje es el psicólogo de Harvard, B.F. Skinner. Skinner partió de las ideas de Pavlov sobre el control experimental y el condicionamiento, del énfasis de Thorndike en la importancia de las consecuencias del entorno y del enfoque de Watson sobre el comportamiento observable.
La psicología es la ciencia del comportamiento humano, apoyada en la ciencia del comportamiento de otros seres. Sin embargo, el comportamiento humano se distingue debido a un cambio particular en su evolución que permitió el nacimiento de los lenguajes como una cultura especial. Y desde luego incluimos en el estudio del comportamiento lo que la gente dice sobre sus procesos mentales, sus intenciones, etc.
Para muchos psicólogos, el comportamiento se explica como un efecto de procesos internos, ya sean mentales o neurológicos. Entienden el comportamiento como la manifestación externa de lo que está ocurriendo en el interior. Sin embargo, Skinner no está de acuerdo. Sus investigaciones definen el comportamiento en términos de su relación con las variables del entorno que le preceden y que le siguen, Este postulado puede definirse como el ABC de la psicología: A de antecedente, B de behavior, comportamiento en inglés, y C de consecuencias.
El comportamiento es algo que ocurre, en primer lugar, porque es parte del fundamento genético del individuo, o bien porque ha sido reforzado por otras vías. Cuando ocurre en estas situaciones y va seguido de una consecuencia, es más probable que ocurra de nuevo. Pero si además, en ese momento, está presente un estímulo, entonces ese estímulo es el que controla las probabilidades. El comportamiento ocurre en situaciones similares a aquellas en las que ha sido reforzado. En definitiva, los tres términos son muy importantes. Si queremos que un organismo haga algo, hemos de crear una vez más el tipo de situación en la que el comportamiento ha sido reforzado.
A principios de los 40, Skinner comenzó a experimentar sobre una respuesta sencilla de un animal simple: una paloma picoteando un disco al que le seguía un reforzador. Una bolita de comida o algo de agua. Un reforzador es algo que incrementa la frecuencia de respuestas. La paloma se desenvolvía en un espacio sencillo, con un entorno muy controlado, al que ahora denominamos la caja de Skinner.
Esta paloma hambrienta se mueve más o menos al azar. Algunas veces gira su cabeza hacia la izquierda. Cuando lo hace, reforzamos ese movimiento, permitiéndole el acceso a un plato de grano. Una vez hemos reforzado a la paloma para que realice un leve giro hacia la izquierda, podemos esperar reforzarla a que la gire un poco más lejos. En diferentes etapas progresivas podemos llegar a un punto en el que la paloma dé un giro completo. La paloma ha aprendido a dar esta respuesta porque ha sido reforzada en etapas sucesivas hacia el patrón final.
A la larga, Skinner creó una cadena de montaje psicológica, en la que los datos de comportamiento eran el producto final. Utilizando mecanismos automáticos, podía presentar estímulos, grabar respuestas y organizar programas de reforzamiento sin la necesidad de la presencia de un investigador. De esta forma, se pueden reunir una enorme cantidad de datos. Más importante todavía, la frecuencia con la cual la paloma picoteaba. Podía medirse con precisión, y esta tasa de respuesta variaba directamente con las consecuencias del reforzamiento. Esta tasa podía ser controlada reorganizando el momento y la frecuencia de las consecuencias del refuerzo. En otras palabras, la conducta de la paloma podía cambiarse modificando las consecuencias. La versión de Skinner del condicionamiento instrumental se denomina condicionamiento operante.
Un buen comportamiento operante es el que opera sobre el entorno y produce consecuencias. El condicionamiento operante es el cambio que tiene lugar cuando esas consecuencias tienen un efecto particular. A este efecto se le denomina fortalecimiento o reforzamiento. Es decir, lo que el sujeto acaba de realizar tiene ahora más probabilidades de repetirse debido a que le han seguido consecuencias reforzantes. Estudiamos el condicionamiento operante organizando las consecuencias, no únicamente para modelar una forma particular de conducta durante un largo periodo de tiempo, sino también para cambiarla ligeramente.
Utilizando técnicas de condicionamiento operante, se ha conseguido entrenar palomas para picar correctamente una suma de números y ejecutar todo tipo de proezas. El condicionamiento operante es un aspecto importante del comportamiento aprendido, pero desde el punto de vista de Skinner, de la psicología, todo comportamiento aprendido puede reducirse a las relaciones entre el comportamiento, sus antecedentes y sus consecuencias. Skinner opina que cualquier comportamiento seguido de una consecuencia cambiará en su tasa de ocurrencia en relación directa con los cambios en dicha consecuencia. Esto es cierto para las palomas, y también es cierto para los seres humanos. De acuerdo con Skinner, la búsqueda de agentes internos para explicar el comportamiento es innecesario.
Si usted quiere ver gente accionando palancas en un programa de razón variable, basta con ir a Las Vegas o Atlantic City. Encontrará cientos de personas haciéndolo, porque se les está pagando según un programa de razón variable. No es necesario que nos preguntemos si funciona con la gente. Realmente funciona.
Aunque las ideas de Skinner sobre psicología son controvertidas, esto no significa que sus principios de condicionamiento operante sean limitados. Nada más lejos de ello. De hecho, su aplicación se ha extendido más allá de los laboratorios de investigación donde fueron descubiertos. Hay muchas aplicaciones prácticas de la teoría del aprendizaje en la vida cotidiana.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and particularly pleased to have these good questions. Some of them are pretty tough, but they really are I think, very basic. I want to start off with one to which I can tie some of the others, and that is, how much do I think that research on animal behavior will contribute to an understanding of and modification of human behavior? In The Behavior of Organisms, published nearly 40 years ago, time flies, I said that I thought the only difference, shall I repeat? All right. I thought that the only difference that I expected to see between animals and what I used to call men, people, was in the field of verbal behavior. And I still think that's true. I got around to doing a book on verbal behavior 20 years later, published in 1957. But it doesn't simply mean that animals suddenly start talking and that's all there is to it. The essential thing is that once verbal behavior became possible, and I think that was due to an evolutionary process that brought the vocal musculature under what I would call operant control, call it voluntary control if you like. Up to that point it had been associated with instinctive cries and so on. But once that became possible to put it crudely, to use speech to be effective, to produce results, then you could have a culture emerge in which people began to ask each other, what are you doing, why are you doing that? In other words, they began to set up the conditions that led people to look at their own behavior and look at themselves and their own bodily processes when they were behaving. I regard consciousness, awareness, as a social product. I can't imagine how the individual would ever become a conscious individual unless there were other people to provide the contingencies that lead him or her to ask questions of that nature. Many people have said, well, how does the behavior deal with the unconscious? Well, that's easy. All behavior begins as unconscious behavior, but some of it becomes conscious when you look at it, analyze it, look at the external conditions under which this behavior occurs, look at the states of your body with which you are in contact. These you call your feelings, your states of mind, and you are then able to talk about these things. Now, a very large part of a culture which makes it so helpful and enables the individual to do so much more as a member of a culture than would be possible as a single individual has to do with making use of the experience of other people. You give someone advice. Now, what does that mean? You yourself have been in contact with some situation, and by describing what you do and the results you get, another person can avoid all of the exploratory behavior which led to that discovery. For example, if you just arrived in Miami, you might find a good restaurant through a process of just going and eating here, 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 and here, until finally you find one which happens to be the kind of restaurant you like. But if you know someone who knows your tastes, that person can say, if you like good Italian food, go to Luigi's. I don't know whether there is a Luigi, so I'm not really puffing anybody up here. That sentence contains two things. One, a description of behavior, go to a restaurant, and another one, some kind of reference to a reinforcing consequence. Go to that restaurant and you will get a good Italian meal. Now, once that has happened, you don't need to bother going all over Miami till you find a good Italian restaurant. And that's a very useful thing. The advice that one person gives another, the warnings that one gives another, the maxims and proverbs, which are sort of general kinds of advice that a culture can develop, these become extremely important. And I've argued, and I think I can convince myself, that governmental and scientific laws are of this nature. They describe behavior and its consequences, and hence can be used instead of the kind of shaping behavior that have to go on otherwise. Someone has said it's rather ridiculous if to shape the behavior of a person as you shape the behavior of a rat or a pigeon, when you can simply tell a person what to do. If I wanted to get a chimpanzee, for example, to pull the plunger of a vending machine, I know how I would do it. I could shape that behavior fairly quickly, and the chimp would learn to pull the plunger and get a bit of something edible. But if it were a person, I could simply say, pull the plunger and you'll get the pack of cigarettes or whatever it is that's going to come out. The instruction on the vending machine, pull plunger and press button under a pack of cigarettes, these are instructions, they're advice, and it saves you the trouble of fumbling around with all of the equipment and the whole environment until finally you find something which produces a pack of cigarettes. And that is, of course, extraordinarily valuable. It does not mean that there's something wrong with the process of shaping behavior, because until you have acquired the behavior of following instructions, nothing else is available. And that is why, with animals, that's about all you have. You can teach animals an imitative repertoire, so you can teach a new response by giving an imitative model. It's very difficult to do, but you do it. And we do it with children. We used verbal descriptions of contingencies and imitative modeling, so that the child watching someone get something immediately knows what to do. But that doesn't come free. It's only after the child has learned to imitate that is possible, so that you don't avoid the essential shaping process in the first place. Now, the cognitive psychology, on the point I made this morning, is concerned with the way you talk about contingencies, the way you give reasons for doing things. And when I say, if you want a good Italian dinner, go to Luigi's, I give you reasons why you should go to Luigi's, because you get a good dinner when you do that. And this kind of thing is, of course, very commonly done, and it is the rational side of human behavior. But Freud saw what was wrong with that. I can say to a person, pull a plunger and you get his pack of cigarettes. But supposing this person is ruining himself gambling, and I say to him, okay, Tim, I can give you some very good advice, stop gambling. That's that. I'll give you reasons for stop gambling. If you stop gambling, you won't lose money. So you stop. Yes, but you don't. You see, the contingencies are more powerful there than the reasons. Now, the reasons are descriptions of the contingencies, but you don't have reasons to follow the reasons. And so you go right on gambling. And that's a problem that therapists face. You can give a patient reasons for behaving well, but that isn't enough, as Freud was very clearly pointed this out. Freud would say with the unconscious reasons, and by unconscious reasons, all he means, all I would mean, and if I said the same thing, is that there are reinforcing contingencies, mostly reinforcing consequences, which are strengthening behavior in opposition to what appear to be the reasons that society gives you for behaving in a given way. As you know that if you want to get along better with your wife, you should stop nagging, or should stop complaining, stop to bed, and so on. All right. Those are reasons, and probably they're correct. On the other hand, it's terribly reinforcing to you to find that she's wrong in this and complain about this and complain about that and so on, so that is what you do. There are reinforcing consequences to determine the behavior. The reasons given aren't enough. And I think the main problem, really, in therapy, it seems to me one of the problems in face-to-face therapy with just not a psychotic, but a neurotic person, is to find the contingencies of reinforcement, which are the troublemaking effects, so that good reasons, which are descriptions of better contingencies, can actually work. Well, that's my explanation of the difference between animals and people. People do talk about what they're doing. They talk about the world in which they live, the contingencies that affect them, and they try to influence each other by describing contingencies. In other words, by giving reasons rather than by reinforcing. Now, I would say that the behavior modifier has discovered that in many cases the reasons won't do it, and that you then work on the contingencies of reinforcement. This would be particularly true of psychotics and retarded people who aren't actually able to respond to reasons. The descriptions of contingencies don't get through to them. Neither do contingencies very often. That's why you have to have very conspicuous reinforcers, such as a token economy. If that works, it works. Of course, you want to get rid of the conspicuous reinforcer as soon as you can. But this whole difference between contingency shaped behavior and rule-governed behavior, which is the rational kind of thing, where you talk about the contingencies and change people because they can learn from the experience of others by following rules, is I think, essentially the difference between a narrow conception of behavior modification and a narrow conception of what cognitive psychology is all about. I would argue that the cognitive processes are also behavioral, and there's no reason to make that distinction. Well, that was, I think, covers several of the questions that have been raised here. I want, since my charming daughter is here, I want to answer one other question right away. It's called a personal question here, person with a question mark after the personal. Would you describe in what way your children were involved with the Skinner box? That means the so-called air crib, not the lever-pressing box. Did you use some principles of behavior analysis to raise your children? What was the outcome? I welcome this question because I like to correct some rumors that go around. I don't know, I'm sure that some of you have heard them. A distinguished psychiatrist, whose name you all know, I won't mention it, told a distinguished person, whose name you also would know, that the child that we raised in the so-called box, the air crib, became psychotic. I wrote to him, I said, we've heard this before, I've often wondered where it came from. Would you mind telling me where you heard this rumor? Our daughter is very intelligent, talented, married. Her husband teaches international studies at the University of Warwick. They live in London and Leamington Spa. My daughter is a very successful artist. She does large colored etchings and sells all she can produce and so on. I don't see any ill effects of the crib on her. Well, he wrote a very apologetic letter, I must say that. He didn't tell me where he heard it. Then one summer, a British critic came over and said to a friend of ours, a professor of literature at Harvard, isn't it too bad about that daughter of the Skinners they raised in the box killing herself? And our friend said, well, when did she do that? I was swimming with her yesterday. But recently I've been getting letters. I've had 2 or 3 in the last month. Is it true that your daughter is suing you? I wish to say, that's the daughter which is not here. I can't put her on display, but she is not suing me. We have a very good relationship, as a matter of fact. As to using behavior modification, it's very curious. I look back on it now. I never did use any kind of contrived reinforcing contingencies on my children, nor are there any in Walden 2. It's a very curious thing, I think. Walden 2 was written 7 years after the publication of The Behavior of Organisms, published 10 years after. It was the application of the principles that I thought I had discovered to the design of a culture. But the reinforcing contingencies in the culture are all natural. In fact, there's a very strong trend against contrived ones. You don't ever say thank you in World War II. That's a contrived reinforcer, you see. And that was true with my children. I never had a token economy. I never had a gold star point system, anything of that sort. The only exception with my younger daughter, Deborah, I did twice shape a bit of behavior through the use of a reinforcer. Once when she was about 7 or 8 months old, I was sitting in the living room holding her on my lap and playing with her and having fun. The room was getting dark, and I reached up and turned on a lamp. And she smiled, and I thought, a reinforcer. So I thought I would just see if I could use it. So I turned the light off, and I waited for her until she lifted her left hand a little bit, and I turned the light on immediately. And then turned it off, and she lifted it again. Pretty soon she was doing this to make the light go on. And a few years later, a man named Fuller did the same thing with a 20-year-old vegetative idiot in the hospital, found that this creature had never shown any sign of intelligence for 20 years, but by using the bottle it ate from in the same way, got this vegetative idiot to do the same thing. So my daughter at least contributed to the improvement in the lives of vegetative idiots. Anyway, when she was 4 or 5 years old, I was telling her a bedtime story, rubbing her back. I was sitting on the edge of her bed, rubbing her back. And I thought, well, this is reinforcing. I'll see what I can do with this. So I waited until she lifted a foot, and I rubbed her back, and I stopped. Lifted her foot again, and I rubbed her back. Then she gave a great kick and started to laugh. I said, what are you laughing at? She said, when I lift my foot, you rub my back. She had advanced from the animal to the human stage by that time. She could talk about the contingencies of reinforcement, and did. And both my daughters would say to me, don't use your psychology on us. And I never actually did. So they turned out well for perhaps the wrong reasons. Let me see. There are some very, very good questions here. I haven't organized them in any. There's one question here about why is it that almost every therapeutic approach, regardless of theoretical orientation, seems to produce some success. This is one of the frustrating things, I think, about theories of psychotherapy. If you're really enthusiastic, it doesn't much matter, especially if it's your own theory. That's the main thing. It works. And this isn't misrepresentation. It's not cheating. I think a patient who has the good luck to fall into the hands of someone who's just discovered a new theory of psychotherapy is a very lucky patient, because you'll get all kinds of very warm attention and so on. I don't know. I can't analyze and try to find the invariance in such a situation, but it would certainly have something to do with the heightened personal attention that a person gives the therapist gives to a patient when a theory is at issue. And I suspect that is it. But what the actual reinforcers are that are operating, I would hesitate to guess. Then there's one here about operant conditioning avoids the question of motivation by claiming that it is a function of a previous history of positive reinforcement. But why and at what point do individual organisms begin to respond differently to different reinforcers? That's a very, very hard question to answer, of course. For one thing, when you start to deal with a human organism, let's say at the age of 1, let alone the age of 21 or 41, there was an enormous history that you can only guess at, things that have happened. And under those conditions, I don't know what you can do except make the best guess as to what has probably happened from some sort of a survey, some way of finding out what has actually been going on. The basic reinforcers of the human organism are due, I assume, like those of all species, to survival value. Now, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily good. I would like to make a great deal of the fact that we are out of date with respect to our current environment, in the sense that we tend to be reinforced by things which no longer need to be that reinforcing for the sake of the survival of the species. Sugar and salt would be examples of this. Until fairly recently, there was very little sugar and salt in the environments of human beings, except in the case of salt, those who lived in Miami and on the ocean. But the species had to have these substances. Sugar sweetness was associated with ripe fruit, and that was about all. And salt, the salt lick that animals go to at great danger to themselves and so on, show you how important it is to be reinforced by salt on the tongue. And until salt was mined and processed and put on every table in salt cellars and on potato chips and all sorts of things like that, it was important that people ate a certain amount of salt. Same thing is true of sugar. Until the discovery of sugar cane and sugar beets and the processing and storage and sale of sugar and the ubiquitous candy counter and so on, it is important that people be reinforced by sugar, because if you run on something nutritious and it tastes sweet, it's good to remember where you got it and how to get it again and so on. However, now, of course, these things are so terribly reinforcing that we overeat both of them and get overweight or destroy the chemical balance in the body. Same thing is true of sexual reinforcement. At a time when the species was decimated by famine, pestilence, and and wars and so on, it was important that human beings copulated every opportunity. And the way that evolved was to make sex extraordinarily reinforcing. Well, now we're overpopulating the world because it is so reinforcing. These are things which we've changed, but the world has changed, and we no longer need to be this susceptible. Now you can say, well, thank God they are that reinforcing, and you can use contraceptives and saccharin and artificial salt and so on, and enjoy. But it is a great problem, and the world is suffering from the survival of a feature of the human organism which is no longer appropriate. I think probably signs of aggressive damage would be one of those too. That if you are in a world where you survive only if you fight well, then any sign that you've hurt someone is a very good thing, because you learn to fight well if somebody groans or cries out and so on when you hit him just right. And I dare say there's some tendency to be reinforced when people are hurt. And we find that all the way from Schadenfreude and all the way down to watching professional football. But anyway, these are the basic reinforcers. Of course, they then are almost immediately overlaid with conditioned reinforcers, the things that eventually get these things for you. What the mother does to the baby is associated with nursing and sweet milk and so on, makes whatever the mother does reinforcing. And there's an elaborate set of reinforcers built up there. The social reinforcers, they come from people who treat you well, and also the negative ones who treat you badly. These are the things that you acquire. But what an individual has acquired in the lifetime, when he comes for, say, therapy at the age of 30 or something of that sort, that I see no way of ever finding that out, so that you could actually make use of the facts. What you can do is to make a current survey of what seems to be reinforcing to this person, and I don't regard that as circular. One of the questions here is it true that the whole idea of reinforcement is circular? Something is reinforcing because it reinforces. But that's about correct. I think you find out what is reinforcing by seeing whether it increases the probability of behavior upon which it is contingent. And there's no more circular than talking about ferrous metals being magnetic and brass not. What is a magnetic? Well, it's something that responds to magnetism, and brass doesn't, and irons do, then circular perhaps, but still a very useful concept. And if you define a reinforcer as something which makes behavior more probable when it is contingent upon the behavior, then that's an observational kind of thing. It is not, I think, basically I think I've answered that one essentially. Following the publication of About Behaviorism in 1974, there was criticism regarding the lack of sufficient philosophical foundation. And the question goes on from that a little further. Philosophers have raised the question about my philosophical sophistication. I can't point to any elaborate education in philosophy, but I believe that this could be said also, let us say, of the logical positivists who did have a great education in the history of philosophy. There are some points of view which more or less invalidate the whole domain of philosophical inquiry. I used an example this morning of that sort in my lecture. You can teach a pigeon to name a single property of an object. You have some panels with colors printed on them, and then are some objects here, and if the object is white, no matter what its shape or size, the pigeon pecks the word white, and if it's red, but no matter what the size or shape, it pecks the word red, and so on. And I had a quotation from Karl Popper. Does this mean that there is an essential property of whiteness, or do we collect a set in terms of that, or there's an alternative expression I won't go into it. There are complicated philosophical statements of what is going on with respect to the essence of an abstract term of that sort. Well, the contingencies are perfectly obvious, and I insist that the contingencies suffice to explain the behavior not only of the pigeon, but of ourselves. When we have singled out separate properties of objects and identify them with terms. Now, it may look as if I were unsophisticated and unaware of all the discussion that's gone on for 2,500 years about invariance and essences and whatnot, but I'm not. Yes, I am. I'm ignorant of that because I've lost interest in it. But the contingencies of reinforcement provide an alternative that seemed to me to be much simpler and certainly much closer to a scientific account of the behavior. Sass and others have said that behaviorism is reductionistic and dehumanizes man. As I've pointed out, it dehomunculizes man. If you believe that the body is steered and run by a little man inside, then behaviorism gets rid of that little man. The body is run by its own structure, the genetic endowment of the species, and its history and contact with the environment and the current environment. I think that is compatible with the most noble view of human nature. I see no dehumanizing about it. The thing that bothers me about these references to behaviorism as being manipulative, and another question brought that up, is this. Chomsky and others have repeatedly said that behaviorism is associated with manipulative political philosophies, by which he means, I suppose, fascism. And as a matter of fact, I have been called fascist, but nothing in anything that I've ever done is in the slightest extent similar to what's happened under what I would call fascist governments. The issue is this: if you think that human behavior is determined primarily by genetic programming, and this is what you mean when you talk about the development of human behavior. Shakespeare had 7 ages, Erik Erikson has 10, Freud had different ones depending upon when you look at Freud's work and so on, but things are growing in the individual. You're born with a knowledge of grammar according to Chomsky and so on. You know the rules of grammar. If you think that we develop in the sense of grow like an embryo, and Chomsky has said, Roger Brown has said that the development of language is like embryonic growth, then you're at one end of the continuum. At the other end, you say that behavior is due to what happens during the lifetime of the individual. You don't deny that you start with an organism, and that is genetic, but it is pliable, manipulable, you can change it, then quite clearly, in that case, manipulation is at the end of the environmental end of the continuum. Because you can change the environment, you can't change the genetic endowment except very slowly through some kind of genetic program. And nobody pays much attention to eugenics these days or any kind of effort. You can't make people speak grammatically by breeding people with better innate grammar. It don't work that way. If you want to teach people to be grammatical, you teach better grammar in schools. Well, if those are the two ends, then you ask which is going to be the one politically most associated with, let's say, vicious political practices. Well, I submit that if you know how to change the environment and are concerned with things like education, therapy, and so on, you will use those ways to bring about the kinds of changes that are important. If you, on the other hand, don't, if you believe this thing is all born into you, then you can't change in any reasonable way at all, and you turn into the most violent ways. The person who really believed in the genetic programming of behavior in the 20th century was Adolf Hitler. That's racism. And Chomsky is absolutely 180 degrees wrong about this. It isn't that racism follows, that it isn't that the concentration camp follows from a theory of innate behavior. It is that when you believe that behavior is innate, you can't think of anything else to do but a final solution which involves a concentration camp. When you are concerned about changing behavior and can do so, then you don't turn to the vicious methods. You turn to better schools, better forms of therapy, better incentive systems, better rehabilitation programs, and so on. So I would say just the opposite from Chomsky, that a good practical behavior modification makes it possible to be humane in dealing with people, whereas the genetic approach leaves you open to nothing but violence. I'm sure that my so-called friend, Dr. Thomas Sauss, would not agree with that. He is the ultimate in a rightist, but also, curiously enough, would believe in the individual as determining his own behavior. Well, that is a form of genetic determination, of course. Well, I don't know whether I should try to probe these anymore, but could I just throw it open to the audience to, if you've asked a question I haven't answered, please bring it up. Yes.
Dr. Skinner, what is, in your opinion, the concept of will, and comment about the concept of will in psychology?
Yes. The concept of will is the question. What is the concept of will? You associate voluntary behavior with what I would call operant behavior. It's the distinction between reflex behavior and voluntary behavior, between the autonomic nervous system, unless we talk about recent discoveries and the modification of that through voluntary action and so on, plus as against the skeletal and so on. What is will? Well, now, operant behavior, or behavior which is determined by its consequences, has no immediately preceding cause. A reflex has. There's a stimulus and a response. So you attribute the response to the stimulus. But when you just suddenly pop out with a remark or action, you suddenly go for a walk, there was nothing there that triggered that. And so you feel that you must have done it as an act of will. That there must have been some inner initiating act, a creative act, if you like. That is always the problem when you're dealing with selection by consequences. And it is precisely the problem that Darwin faced in The Origin of Species. The crucial word in that title is origin, the beginnings of something. How can you deal with the beginnings of the species. Well, an act of creation is one way to do it. But by selection, there is no prior act, you see. And then for a long time, though, people tried to talk about creative evolution, as even so there must have been some design in it. But now the biochemists and others have got that all figured out, and there is no prior act of will in the development of the human species. And similarly, if you accept the view of operant conditioning, there is no prior act of will in determining operant behavior. Just you don't need the concept. The behavior occurs depending upon states of deprivation and histories of reinforcement under comparable circumstances. The circumstances are never, they're compelled, they're predisposing but not compelling. Yes. Yes.
Dr. Skinner, I think one of the sources of controversy between the behavioral approach and the psychoanalytic approach has always been the processes within the black box.
Yes.
That historically the behaviorists have only been interested in input and output, and the psychoanalytically oriented people have been concerned about intrapsychic processes. How would you describe events in which mood or intrapsychic state appear to be the determinants of behavior rather than any observable input or discriminative stimuli, such as, for example, a sniper or somebody who does a very violent act, has historically been a very quiet or nice person, suddenly shocks everybody with newspaper publicity. There's no precedent for that kind of behavior. The theory being that it's intrapsychic processes which are predisposed towards it, which are unobservable.
Yes, I don't want to say that I can explain the sniper that way. I wouldn't say that for a moment. I think the issue is the extent to which we need to talk about what Freud called the mental apparatus. I think Freud's contribution was showing causal relationships between what people do and what has happened to them in the past. But Freud himself said that his great contribution was the revealing of the mental apparatus. And I regard that mental apparatus as a rather inadequate and awkward way of representing the causal relationships. Supposing you've got sibling rivalry. When a boy was young, he beat up his brother and his father whaled the life out of him. Then all through his life he suffers from anxiety because of this punishment he's received, and as a result he's not able to be with other people comfortably. Is he going to haul off and hit somebody, or somebody going to hit him, and so on. Well, now you could say that the punishing episode in childhood is brought down to the present through a feeling of anxiety, and that the feeling of anxiety is what makes it difficult for this person now to feel at home in a group of people and to be natural and so on. But I would question whether or not the feeling is a causal stage. I would argue that the punishing episode is what is producing the present disordered behavior. If such a person comes for therapy and you say, well, now tell me how you feel about this, he certainly will tell you a lot about feelings. What he's describing, as far as I'm concerned, is the states of his own body. I don't believe he's describing mental states. He's describing his own body, which is states of his body which are associated with prior punishment, effective or ineffective action now, and so on. But to take that as causal is a mistake that I feel is being made. Yes.
Well, you do. I think you do point out that the ability to respond to a stimulus depends on the state of deprivation. For example,
yes.
Food is a stimulus.
Yes.
Isn't it possible that mood or feeling states can also affect the likelihood or probability of a reinforcing event, where prior the frequency of behavior was high in the presence of an older mood, that without any intervening change in the reinforcement history, that frequency changes because of the mood rather than because of something.
Well, what is felt in a given mood is possibly quite relevant, yes, but not the feeling. As a person who has been punished and is therefore very hesitant about doing something, starts and stops, and so on, will tell you, I feel diffident, I feel embarrassed, I feel a lot of other things. These are things he has learned to say he feels because he's been taught by society to use those words in describing his behavior, which we would describe only the behavior in using those words. You're being very diffident about this, I notice. We have no information about the feeling, but he has additional information about states of his own body, which he puts into the picture called diffidence or embarrassment, and that's what he talks about. And those are important things to notice, but I would say that he is behaving as he's behaving because of the punishing episode and not because of the state of the body he is feeling. Now, if the physiologists come along and give a very good picture of that state, they will have a different kind of intervening situation, which will be very helpful when we have it, to explain the behavior. The trouble with introspective descriptions is their very great inadequacy. We cannot. I can teach a child red, green, and blue if he's not colorblind, but I can't say, now this is diffidence and this is embarrassment. Do you see the difference? Because I'm not quite sure when the child is diffident and when he's embarrassed. And I can judge his behavior, and he may very well use the words in terms of his own behavior, but there will be bodily states associated which will come into his description, and they may be relevant or they may not be. And so that his use of these words is bound to be slightly fuzzy, and as a result, what we call his knowledge of his own body is going to be fuzzy. It's going to be very uncertain. We do not have good self-knowledge because there are no contingencies that shape that behavior.
In the experiment that you described earlier,
yes,
I suppose you would call an abstract fact, which infects in the presence of
right.
To what degree do you suppose that the processes you discussed in verbal behavior could be demonstrated with experiments with non-humans, let's say kittens or chimpanzees?
Well, I think many of them could be. I think the work with chimps is promising. I wish the people who were doing it would pay more attention to a good functional analysis of what they're doing. The sign language experiments seem to me to be the most profitable here. The artificial ones, poking signs and putting counters up and so on, those are not needed, and the sign language experiments are very promising. These chimps can do a great deal that no one thought a non-human primate could do. How far it can go, I don't know. Whether you could ever teach a chimp something which could be called awareness or self-knowledge. Can you say to a chimp, why did you do that, and teach him to give you an answer? Those things came very late in the emergence of verbal behavior in human people, and I doubt very much whether you're going to get that in the lifetime of a chimp. It's just much too slow in picking them up. Yes.
You appear to
yes.
You appear to view mental or conscious processes as being epiphenomena, that is, byproducts without true causal roles in behavior. I was wondering if they're truly without a causal role in human behavior, how is it that verbal expressions and descriptions of these mental come to be? That is, how could a powerless byproduct be able to influence our ability to speak and our ability to write?
I'm not sure I get the point. These are epiphenomena or byproducts, but what do they do, or what use?
How is it that we're able to speak about them here today as being something that exists if they haven't in some way been able to signal that through some kind of causal mechanism?
Oh no, but this would be true of any mythology. I could talk about all kinds of mythologies here today too, you see.
Speak about them as if we believe in them. I don't believe in mythologies.
No, you don't now, but I mean, I could be addressing an audience that does, actually. The fact that people talk very seriously about haunted houses and so on doesn't mean to me that there must be haunted houses. I don't really think, I don't even think, what?
now to be denying that they exist altogether, rather than denying that they have a causal role?
No, what I'm denying is the existence of anything non-physical. If that's what you mean by epiphenomena, then I would deny their existence. What we feel are our own bodies, and one of the difficulties there is that we don't have very good nervous systems for doing this. I've made that point elsewhere. You see, by the time the verbal community got around to asking people, why did you do that? Why are you doing that? What are you going to do now? The only nervous systems that had evolved were those like the interoceptive nervous system concerned with internal economy, or the proprioceptive system with posture and so on, or the exteroceptive. There were no nervous systems that went to those parts of the brain that are really involved in these explanations that you like to be able to give. So you don't have nerves going to the right places to talk about this kind of stuff that seems to be so important. Physiologists will get there with instruments eventually, but we're not going to get there introspectively.
Perhaps through a combination of introspection and physiology will get there even faster.
Well, if you can demonstrate that, yes, and there are those who work on introspection in close connection with physiologists, and I have no objection to that at all. I think people working in the field of visual perception, for example, the McCulloch effect and so on, things that Dick Hell does and so on, these are done primarily because of the special information they would give a physiologist with their behavioral data, I think. At least they can be given a behavioral statement. Yes.
Dr. Skinner, we're all delighted to have you here. And it is the anxiety that I ask questions.
You don't see any difference, and I'm not sure I do either. Certainly, a drug will produce a feeling, as it will change the state of a body, which can then be reported by someone who describes his own body and has learned to do so. I would ask you, first of all, though, if your patient says to you, I feel depressed, should you not be rather curious as to how he and under what conditions he learned to use that word?
Yes.
And would you not expect that it would be taught to him at times when it was his behavior that was depressed rather than a feeling which no one else could see?
I don't know which came first.
What?
Regardless of what he answers, I don't know which came first.
Well, all right. Let's let that go. You see that the person is not doing what he doesn't pay attention to business. He sits and doesn't say anything in the conversation and so on. You say, that man's depressed. He may have his head down and so on. The James Lange theory. Lange was much better than James in discussing and describing these conditions of the body which are weighed down with grief and so on. He has a lot of depression in there too. Well, all of this is the way that society teaches a person to say, I am depressed. Now, at the same time, the person feels something inside too. And possibly there can arise a condition with none of the external stuff at all, and the person will say, I am depressed. And so if he comes to you and he says that, you could say, this person is telling me that his body is in a state, so far as he has any nerves going to it, associated with the conditions which have led the verbal community to teach him to use the word depressed. Now, do you want to say that it was that bodily state that caused him to have his head down and not speak up in the conversation and so on, or vice versa? That's the egg and the hen question that you're raising. Which came first, I suppose? I would say they're both part of the same kinds of thing. There are certain conditions that do this. Now, what do you want to do about it, though? How are you going to treat this? If it's a drug thing, you get rid of the drug, obviously.
Dr. Skinner, you see, we're talking about symptom removal. And that's why, coming back to one of your earlier questions that you answered and said you really don't know the answer to, why all kind of therapies work, is because most are self-limiting. And people resolve their own problems, whether they're social or biophysical or emotional. So whatever you do works. I mean, in most situations, most people are going to get better. Just because aspirin relieves headache doesn't mean that the lack of aspirin is the cause of the headache.
No, that's true. But are you suffering from, let's make it a toothache instead of a headache. I don't know where it is in the head, but when you take aspirin for a toothache, are you getting rid of the ache? And if so, why do you bother with a dentist? The dentist treats the tooth, not the ache, right? Aspirin cuts off the connection between the tooth and you.
I would agree. We treat symptoms. If it didn't ache, the dentist would not treat the tooth. The patient would never come to him. So he treats the ache too, but he treats it in a different way.
Well, he can do that, yes, of course.
Well, then he's treating the ache just as well as the man who gives him aspirin. He's treating the way the patient feels. If the patient didn't feel bad, he wouldn't come in, or he wouldn't come in.
If you would change the way the patient feels to what the patient feels, I would be very happy about that.
I think we do that.
Yeah.
I hope that we do that, regardless what we do.
Yeah.
Whether we approach it from the quote behavioral viewpoint or from the psychological viewpoint, because I think it's the same, really.
My only concern here is to see the role of the operant kind of behavior in these states, whereas the Wolpe kind of desensitization might deal with the feeling. Now, supposing you've got a person who's moved from one city to another, is supposedly a common source of depression. You've got a whole repertoire that works very well in one city. You call up your friends and they're there. You go to the store and the store is there. You go to the movies and their movies are there, and so on. Everything, you have a big repertoire of behavior, all works. You move to another city, nothing. The phone, that number won't dial up your friend. There's no store where you went before, and so on. And then you get depressed. At least it's said that this is a very common kind of depression. I don't think it may be a very important symptom anyway. Now, what can you do? Well, could you desensitize by having a person relax and try to get rid of the feeling of depression? Or could you just build up a new repertoire of the new town, in which case the depression would disappear because the conditions which were causing it have disappeared? Which would you, I don't want to ask you to say which you prefer, but I myself would think that in that case it is the unavailability of a suitable behavior in a given environment that gives you this feeling of depression. And the solution to that is to build suitable behavior. You get this very often, kids just getting out of college. They've had a very successful college career, they've had just the right behavior with their friends in college or their courses and so on. Suddenly they're cast on the world, no job or a job that they're not familiar with and so on. They get this same kind of depression. They don't have any behavior that's really paying off. Now, you can deal with that as a feeling, or you can build up behavior and help them find something that pays off until they have another repertoire which is just as good as the one they had in college, and then they're on their way. Now, where are you going to put the feeling the state felt in that picture?